Good evening. Good evening. I'm Cynthia Hoven, and this is our study on our journey after death into the spheres, presentation number 4. I'm glad to have you along again. Thank you for coming. As always, let's begin our evening by remembering and making ourselves very conscious of the fact that we're not alone. That those who have crossed the threshold of death are near to us still. And especially when we call upon them, when we do our spiritual work, when we affirm that we're here for them, creating connections with them, especially when we are mindful of their presence, then they will draw near to us. So invite your friends in the spiritual world to gather around and think these living thoughts with you. I will call upon several friends whom I have and I'm carrying now. And I call especially upon David Gershon, who crossed the threshold of death in the beginning of 2022, quite unexpectedly. And we were in the middle of a lot of really busy life projects. So, David, be with me. Let your wisdom be part of our journey. And once again, I invite you to light a candle if you have a candle in your room, even as I will do. And this candle externalizes, makes visible the warmth of your love to them. Because flames are living light. So may this warm you. And as I've done in each week, I'm going to speak a verse. And this verse will be different from the one that I've read in previous weeks, because in this week, we're going to be speaking in a different tone, not in such a schematic way, but a little more personally about the journey that people go through, both in blissness and with difficulties. And when a person passes through the threshold of death with difficulties, they can be beset with what they experience as coldness and darkness. And so we have many prayers and verses that Rudolf Steiner wrote. Other prayers work as well, the Lord's Prayer, for instance. But I recommended this book to you called Staying Connected, a collection of essays by Rudolf Steiner that he wrote, which includes a number of verses and prayers that one can hold in one's mind in reaching across the threshold. And I will read one of these. Faithfully, I will follow your soul through the gate of death into the light engendering places of time. With love, I will ease spirit coldness for you. With knowing, I will untangle spirit light for you. With thinking, I will linger with you. And let me go through that once again. And we are listening for these 3 gifts that we offer: love, knowing, and knowing is what we're doing in this class, thinking, being alive and living thought for those who have died. And this is to help the coldness and the confusion of the person who has died and hasn't found their light. Faithfully, I will follow your soul through the gate of death into the light engendering time places. With love, I will ease spirit coldness for you. With knowing, I will untangle spirit light for you. With thinking, I will linger with you. So invite your friends to gather around. And I also express in this moment my unending gratitude for the great initiate Rudolf Steiner and all of the insights into spiritual knowledge that he articulated for humanity. And so much of what he brought to us is the source for what I'm sharing in these conversations. Now, in preparation for getting started, let's take a quick look again at what we're talking about when we speak about life after death. Thoughts that I'm sure most of you are conversant with, but let's just remember, you are not your body. Your body is the instrument, the dress that you wear. And actually, we have several bodies. Our outermost and the most tangible body is the physical body. And the physical body, woven of the stuff of the earth, but designed out of the great mind of God and all the spiritual beings, this body is permeated with the etheric body, the life body, which makes your body alive as you're alive, helps it to work with living metabolic processes, and also, perhaps surprisingly, enables living thinking, so that not only does it keep your body alive, but it also keeps your consciousness processes alive, so that you're not a mechanical machine in your consciousness. But that etheric body, also an aura, it's another body that you wear, but that's not all either. We also wear an astral body. The astral body is a star body, and it's a body that is sensitive, that takes impressions into you. And perhaps the easiest way to try to characterize it is to say, it delivers these sensations to yourself. It impresses them upon you. And that stimulates us to awareness. And it's the nature of present day humanity living on Earth that while we're on Earth, we have adopted the way of being that we let the astral body give us our sensations, unless we have awoken to spiritual individuated consciousness. This could be by a very powerful initiation process, possibly a religious process, but awakening your core. If we have done this, awoken through initiation, or just by practicing presencing until it becomes a practice that you can do constantly, until you can do that, you let the astral body talk to you, it mediate sensations to you through all the years of your life. The inner core of ourselves is the I am, or the ego. And this I am is actually that which comes from the heart of God, from the greatest possible periphery before you were born. And as you become embodied, it clothes itself with an astral body. And at that point, when you're still in the spiritual world, it is paying attention to spirit archetypes. And then as you approach the earth, it clothes itself in the sun radiant etheric body. And then as you come closer, everything slips into the developing physical body that is growing in the womb of the mother. And so the greatest part of you, the ego, becomes the inmost part of you, not physically located in any point, but a core of pure spirit consciousness surrounded by these bodies. And then we live our lives. And then, as you know from our previous evenings, as we live our lives, at night, the physical and etheric body stay in bed and vegetatively rejuvenate the carrier of our lives on earth, physical and etheric, while the astral body and the ego return to pure body-free experiences and rejuvenate themselves by immersing themselves in the archetypes of pure spirit beings, angels and archangels, and the archetypes that your body needs to rejuvenate each night. And then in the morning, the ego and the astral body are woven once again into the physical body and the etheric body. And for the most part, we forget to be conscious of the spiritual world. And then, as we've thought about and we've talked about all these evenings, at the moment of death, the physical and the etheric body physical and the astral, the ego and the astral body draw the etheric body out of the physical body. And for the first time in the decades of your life, the physical body remains behind and falls into the processes of death, while the higher bodies begin to unfold themselves in a cosmic way as the ego makes its way back to the sources in pure spirit realms. And in that process, we return to the stars, hopefully more individuated, hopefully grown, nonetheless incredibly aware of how far we have yet to go before we become full human beings, full divine, free, loving, perfect human beings. Fortunately, we have untold times in the future to continue to develop to become the hierarchy of love and freedom. So this is what we have been building in the weeks to come, the weeks already come. And for the next 2 weeks, we're going to push this a little bit further. And I'm going to be drawing very much, especially this week, also next week, with some different kinds of descriptions of what happens after death in the cases of a death that goes well and of a death that goes in a difficult way, and people who are struggling. And next week, we'll speak a bit more about how we can connect with those who have died, how we can help them by reading to them, and so on. I'm going to be taking a lot of examples from a book that I'm holding in my hand. And the woman who wrote this book, Iris Paxino, is a student of anthroposophy. And she does something that I've never seen anyone else do in this way, in a very extremely conscious, non-sensational, matter-of-fact, and wise way. She speaks of the experiences that she, as a clairvoyant person, has with those who have died. And I've spent my life since my childhood reading books about research into life after death of all stripes. And I know some of them can be somewhat sensational or ungrounded. And I have great confidence in what this woman writes because they're very sober and careful and clean and in line with what we have with anthroposophy. And so I'm going to bring you a lot of this work. And this is a book that you're able to buy. The woman's name is Iris Paxino. And for those of you who read German, it's called Brücken zwischen Leben und Tod, which is called in English, bridges between life and death. And Michelle is going to type that into the chat box. And I'll also have it listed on the PDF that you're going to get today. So you hopefully, if this is material that you want to read, I recommend you get it. In Europe, I know it's available through Flores Press. In the United States, it's available at least through Amazon, and I don't know what other sources we have, but you'll be able to find it. Happy it's in English now. All right, we're going to begin with speaking about approaching the threshold of death. I was lucky enough to be present at the deaths of both of my parents. They happened 10 years apart, 9 years apart from each other, but situations happened that I was able to be there for both of them. And they were powerful experiences. And since then, I've listened to other people's experiences, and every death is as individual as every birth. Something really special happens with each one. And I'll tell you first about my mother's birth. My mother's death and birth into a new world. My mother was 86. She came to 85, came to live in my home, in my town, consciously for the last years of her life, because I had told her that I would be honored to be there with her to help when her time of transitioning came, and to help her with her the health needs of her last years. And as her time came near, she had kidney failure and was told that she was going to need dialysis. And her body was failing in other ways already. And she was very clear that she didn't want to do that. And so in the middle of the night, one night she called me and said, I'm ready to leave this life. And I've eaten my last food. I've had my last drink to drink, taking no more medicines. I would like you to bring me over to your house and let me make my transition in your home. I said, okay, we'll do that. And the next day I went to the assisted living place where she was. And I said, to get hospice care, we're going to need to call your physician. And we called the physician and he said, yeah, she's just depressed. No, we can't do that. I would need to see her before I would let her go. Took her to the hospital. My dear mother, in her inimitable way, picked herself up. She was so frail, I had to almost carry her to the car. She got there, she started to laugh and flirt in her famous way with the orderlies at the hospital, at the med center. But then when she got to the doctor's office, she became quite sober and said, look, I've spent my life aware that there's a whole nother dimension of life after death. I'm not at all afraid. I'm ready to go. And I want you to make that possible for me. Not depressed, do this in full consciousness. And the doctor did that and set her up for hospice. I brought her to my home. In those as soon as we got here, we put up a hospital bed and prepared this transition. She was still quite conscious, but it was clear she wouldn't get out of bed. I was told that it takes a matter of weeks to die from kidney failure. So we settled in for that. We made sure that the money was taken care of, the estate was taken care of. I wrote to all the friends of hers that I could find and invited them to send her goodbye cards. We filled her room with music. One night we had a beautiful memorial where we played. I had a cellist come in, played music for her. I wrote all of the notes to her that people had written from around the country. And then after that, she said, it's clear. I don't need that anymore. In fact, I don't even want music in my room anymore. It pulls me into my body too much. I'm ready. It still lasted another week. And gradually, well, she started to have delusions. That's what happens with kidney failure. And she was good-humored enough to tell jokes. But then she slipped into a light coma, and I kept expecting any moment there would be her last death. And it didn't come. And one day I said to a friend of mine, I don't know what she's waiting for. My friend said, oh, there must be one last thing that she's waiting for. Something's not done. That's not true, I said. But that night I was alone in my home. My husband and daughter had left. And I said, if there's anything I have left to tell her, it's about my understanding of reincarnation. I never wanted to talk to her about that because I didn't want to infringe upon her religious freedom. She thought she could just go to some other solar system and leave this whole earth, which is not my picture. So at that moment, I said, maybe if there's anything else, let me try to explain to her in her comatose mind what I see. So I just went to my bookshelf. Perhaps you know the technique. I think I've heard it from Edgar Cayce. I don't know. Go to your bookshelf, shut your eyes, feel for a book, take it out. And the book was a book by Rudolf Steiner, which spoke about life after death and actually about the significance of Christ as the bearer of light in the world after death. I came and sat at her bedside and began to read. Coma, no eye contact, nothing. And I came to the sentence after 4 pages. Ever since the birth of Christ and Christ's death and his reconnection with the spiritual earth, everything has changed about death for the human being. Everything has changed about death for our planet, where that light will always be with us on this earth. And that was the moment. At that moment, her breathing radically changed as I read those sentences. A presence entered the room. I could feel it. And my mother, with 3 exhalations, left. But it was clear, it was like an explosion into the light, and there were spiritual beings right there with us in the room to greet her. And I could say nothing else than hallelujah. How beautiful. You've been welcomed. You're in the light. And the radiance of her being was as tangible to me as the frames of her bed that was right next to me. So I'm so grateful to have been able to midwife her journey into that other world. And I call that a death well died, a birth well born. And I want to contrast that. As I said, there are so many different kinds of deaths. With the death that a friend of mine told me about in the same sort of season, her father died. And we shared death stories. She said her father was quite ill, but he didn't want to die. He was so attached to this earth. He had no belief in life after death whatsoever. And so as he lay in his deathbed, he said to his brother who was there next to him, I want you to go to the bank, empty out our accounts, empty out the safe deposit, bring everything to me here. His brother did that, filled the bed with coins and bills and papers, everything. And her father said, this is me. That's mine. That's all mine. And he gloated. And the next day he died. But that's a very different kind of death. What does he find when he doesn't believe in consciousness on the other side? He only believes that his value was determined by all of that money that he had made. I would love to hear some of your stories, or don't have time for that, but dear friends, in the PDF that you get every week, there's always a link to what we call the forum on my website. And for anyone who is willing to write a description of the death of someone who was dear to them on that forum page and share it with our community, please do. I think we would all love to hear more of these death, birth stories. All right, with that as a background, let's turn now to what we're going to hear from Iris Paxino, who has had experiences with so many people who have died. And she begins her book by talking about approaching the threshold of death. My mother's journey is one story. So there are different ways, of course, to approach the threshold. Perhaps a very common way is to approach it through illness. And one can sometimes anticipate that death is approaching someone because they begin to speak about dying in a new way. They have thoughts of dying. And as death comes ever closer, possibly, there are stories about as people are getting close and they start to go into a less cognitive state, they begin to say, my mother has called me. My friend has called. I see my husband, or I see my angel. That must be my angel. I didn't know I had it. There's my angel waiting for me. And when these beings start to assemble around a person, death is drawing closer. Another aspect of what's going on, of course, is the ordering of personal effects, accounts, passwords, the last will, perhaps communication with people, all of that. And if you're a midwife, a personal friend, midwife for someone who is dying, they might welcome your help with that. A really important and valuable help for someone who's getting ready to die is if you yourself can help them to review their biography. Or there are people who do this as a service, sometimes for money, sometimes not. Sometimes there are people called death doulas who help to take care of that. But if you could write it, assemble pictures, or just, take down their dictation, but help them to review their lives so that they can pre-digest what they're going to go through soon in the Kamaloka that we've talked about before. So they're already beginning to remember the events of their life consciously, digest their experiences, see what was valuable, what was not valuable. And in many cases, people will express regrets, perhaps about a friendship gone bad, and perhaps they will want to reach out and make good on that. Perhaps it's possible physically. Perhaps you can just help them to open their heart to that, making amends somehow. But maybe they can actually take a step. If a person that they want to make amends with has already died, what you can do is see if they can ask for forgiveness or offer forgiveness to the person who has died. They will meet that other person after they've died, and they will have to work through any unresolved issues. But if you prepare it already with them now, it will go better. Then in the very last days before death, it is a new shift comes. And Rudolf Steiner tells how we all have what's called a doppelganger, a double, a shadow self that joins with our body, joins us at the heels at the time of birth. And this is kind of like the suitcase that we have to carry around in our present material physical life. This part of us that is plugged into the electromagnetic fields of the earth, the electromagnetic fields of life. And this being has a being quality, is part of making us really rigid and cold in our habits, in our thinking, in our behaviors, in our attitudes and prejudices. And this being, Rudolf Steiner describes that, would really like to go through death with us, but they can't. Death is ours. And the doppelganger always, especially in the case of illness, leaves the body before the moment of death. And in doing so, suddenly, it's very common to see in the last 2 or 3 days, when a person has been freed from their doppelganger, that there is you can feel as if you are seeing them anew, a stress and a tension that they weren't even aware of disappears from them, and you begin to see an angelic self shining through them. When that comes, you can know that death is nearing. This is speaking of an easy death, a good death, like my mother's death, essentially. These are examples of peaceful deaths. So when that happens, when the death comes at the moment of death, you will notice a change in their breathing. Those of you who have been there for deaths, you know that there's, well, for one thing, it's a slow, lingering illness. The breath becomes light and with long pauses in between. So often you think, was that the last breath? Did I miss it? No, there comes another breath, but you can scarcely hear it. And then when the moment of death comes, you'll see the last thing that happens is an exhalation. This is the first thing that happens at birth is an inhalation. Last thing that happens is an exhalation and no more inhalations. Through that, the self is released into the etheric space of the earth. Then, as I explained with my mother, you can experience the life body, the etheric body of the person who has died. We'll come back and speak a little bit more again, as we've done in previous weeks, about reading the memories in the etheric body. But the person has, both the person who experiences it and those who get to watch it have a feeling of resurrection. Rudolf Steiner says that's one of the most significant moments in a person's entire spiritual biography. The moment at death where a person feels, I didn't die, I still am, and is in this realm of great light. And in that realm, they're in a space where other beings can be embodied. The angelic beings, the personal angel, and others, and also family and friends. And many of you will know how frequently we can read and hear about people saying that they have been met when they cross the threshold. Also, we mustn't discount that at this moment, the earth is going to take the physical body back again. And so at that moment, Rudolf Steiner describes, and also this woman, Iris Paxino, that the elemental beings who have loaned to us the forces out of which our body is made, the elemental beings crowd into the room. They crowd into the room and they want to take that body back. It's so interesting for them. So they're all gathered too. And we'll come back and speak about them in just a moment when we talk about taking care of the body after death. But we must, because this evening's presentation is also going to speak a bit about difficult deaths, we can also take a moment to think about how many other ways there can be problems. If a person has an accident, a sudden death, then they can experience that they've been ripped out of their body. In some cases, a person like Iris can understand that this accident was part of a pre-birthly decision that a person made. That whatever health I'm in at the age of 33 or 57 or 18, I will go back into the spiritual world. I just have that many things to accomplish in this life, and then I will leave. And whatever makes that possible, and that might be an accident, a car accident, falling off a mountainside. So Iris describes a story about a man, a father with 2 young children, well loved. He was out mountain climbing, climbed a cliff, fell off the mountain and died. His whole community was shocked by that. And she went to his funeral, and in that funeral, she was able to converse with him, which is a practice that she works on carefully and consciously. She said, "Why?" He said, "This was a decision made before I died, but why your children have to grow up without you?" Actually, he said, we agreed that even before they were born, I won't leave them. They'll be fine. I won't leave them. I'll just help them from another dimension. And your wife, she also already knew it in spirit. I will continue to be in relationship to this situation. And why did you die in the mountains? I wanted my beingness to be a gift back to the natural world. I loved mountain climbing. The moment of death wasn't painful. It was an easy separation. I was feeling like I was flying, and now I offered my body back to the earth. So I don't mean, of course, I don't mean to trivialize that in any way, but this is a possibility. When another kind of very difficult death can be a murder, of course, and that can be a particular karmic situation for 2 people. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, guilt and forgiveness and so on. And also a real shock can be suicide. And let's just linger here for a moment. A person who commits suicide thinks that by committing themselves, they will be able to leave their existence, be blotted out, have nothing more. In that case, it's not easy to say, I'm still alive. I haven't died. And all of the things that led to that suicide, I'm speaking was most concerned about suicides that might be caused by depression, but that is not easy to recognize that one has thereby created a whole nother level of problems. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit. Another difficulty can be for people who have taken a lot of mind-altering painkillers, because such a person might not even recognize that they've died. They might enter the spiritual world and they might have been so numbed by the painkillers that they will have been half out of their bodies, even in those last hours, days, weeks, months before they died. And the transition, when the body stops breathing, is something that they might not even notice. And in that case, the person might continue to be in a kind of never, never enchanted land for a while. Of course, I'm not going to say anything against painkillers, but I think it's awesome if a person is in a position not to have painkillers to go through that threshold consciously. And on the other hand, if small amounts of morphine are possibly necessary to ease the fear, maybe that's okay. But just consider it's better not to go through in such a clouded, nebulous state. And another condition that can cause that can be death after a really long and lingering illness. We can think of someone who might have been in a coma for a long time, or out of other reasons might have just been sleeping in bed for a long time. I'm not talking here about Lou Gehrig's disease and things like that. That's a different dilemma, of course. But someone who has just not been in this world for some period of time, they also, regardless of mind-altering painkillers or not, they might not really know when they've died. So those are some of those difficulties. We will come back shortly to talk more about them. But I want to continue on this archetypal journey of a death well died. And as I said before, by reading many, many studies of near-death experiences, we read how after death, the etheric body opens up and becomes a light body. And now, as I said, all of the events that one has gone through in the years, decades of one's life, and live in the etheric body as memories. And they're laid out in front of the person in simultaneous time. Of course, we don't quite have a picture of that. What we can imagine, I could turn to my right or my left or behind me, and wherever I turn, there is a memory picture of what happened when I was 27 or 13 or 55. The time of my life becomes a simultaneous broadcast of all of the pictures, all of the experiences that I've had in my life. And in that, the different things that we've been through carry a different light value. The things that really enriched ourselves or the world light up with more significance and the light of brightness, of clarity and love. And the things that were difficult, dark, will have less light. And very objectively, we can see our accomplishments and we can see our failures. At this point, they're not judgments. We can just soberly see, yeah, that I was able to be, I was so lucky that I could doctor that person through their illness. I actually was, I was plagued by resentment towards this person, and I feel shame towards that. All of these things without judgment, but sober assessments of the life just lived. Also, a realization of the things that we have neglected to do. I didn't, whenever I saw, I'll just make this one up, whenever I saw a homeless person, I just couldn't stand it. I froze my heart and just walked around them so I wasn't confronted with sharing their pain, things like that. What we've neglected to do is there as a sober fact. In that perspective of those 3 days, one can also still see those who are in the physical world. Very often, a person will go to the place where another person is living or is and visit a friend in a foreign country or whatever, just appear. There's enough freedom of movement that the consciousness can go. But even more than that, more specifically, one can see the people gathered in the room around them. One can see the people at home, the people who have loved them. And we can perceive the thoughts and the feelings of those who have survived. And they need the candle of our consciousness. And here, it's interesting to say, here we must realize that our grief at losing them doesn't help them. And of course, to a certain extent, it's really appropriate. It's not inappropriate to feel the pain that we'll never be able to talk to them again, physically or on the telephone. We'll never be able to touch them. We'll never be able to hold them. We won't have an immediate feedback, face-to-face conversation. Of course, there's a lot of loss in that. We know that. But we need to get through that, because if our grief is born out of our wanting to hold on to their past, and we wish that we could drag them back, or if we feel sorry for them, we're holding them back like chains when they are moving into the light. And at the same time, they need to know so much that we continue to believe in their existence. And Iris Paxino describes several situations, I'm sure there are countless situations, of how grievous it is if a person's survivors don't believe in life after death. If they don't believe in life after death, they feel there's no one there on the earth for me. There's no light for me. There's no one holding space. She describes vividly a man who so dearly loved his wife and children. And when he died, she had nothing for him. She had absolutely no belief in existence after death. So she was closing the curtain, resolved to put his burial behind her, move on with her life, with the children. And there was no connection. And he felt as if cut off from this world. No love, no warmth. This is an example of a situation where that person's angel and those other family who have died need to step in, but also any community of friends who might help that person hold the space for them, like the verse that I was reading to you earlier. This is a time for them of review and release and farewell. And in a good case, they feel freedom, they feel harmony, they feel light. Others might need care, and they might need special help. They might need counseling from their survivors if they can't tell where they are. And it's so important that we send to them our warmth of heart, the light from our hearts, to offer them our strength. Now, in that time, what will we do with the body? And I'm so lucky that in our community we have wise people who have committed themselves to having a very conscious cultivation of this time after death. Many church traditions, as you know, have a practice of having a 3-day wake. And we know it's different in other cultures. In China, for instance, where I have often visited, people are so afraid of death that they just they put the body away. But I've also experienced other things in death. Something that I found in China, I found excessively materialistic. I didn't see this often, but it's something that reminds me of Egypt. You know, in Egypt, a body would be embalmed, but then they would surround the person who has died with artifacts from the life just lived, and give them like symbols to take with them after death, maybe give them money or whatever. And I have seen in China something similar, that people would fill the coffin with little imitation cars, imitation packages of cigarettes, imitation of paper money, all kinds of things that would, so to speak, equip them to live the life in the other world just as if they were living it here. And that baffles me. Well, that's not what we do, I'm glad to say. There are, as you know, also some traditions. I believe the Jewish tradition, I could be wrong, the Muslim tradition wants to take care of the body already within 24 hours or before the sun goes down. It's considered a sacred responsibility. And obviously that comes from their own spiritual insight, and to some extent is also born out of an understanding of those really hot climates. But in our anthroposophical work, we choose not to embalm the body, because embalming the body prevents or hinders a healthy and easy separation of the etheric body from the physical body. So we prefer to let the etheric body pull out thoroughly over the course of those 3 days. You know, that was a big opening, flowering after death. And then bit by bit, the etheric body separates. But to get it out of the fingers and the toes and the fingernails and everything, it's accomplished in 3 days. In that time, as I said, the elemental beings want to grab onto the physical body and start tearing it down. So we do celebrate a wake. And I was so blessed that I could do what we do best. I called our death midwives to my home. We properly took care of my mother's body. That involves emptying any orifices so that there's no waste materials left in the body, stuffing the nose with cotton and things, washing the body and blessing it, dressing it, putting it in a coffin, and then lining the coffin with dry ice. And I think there's something else that people are using now, maybe cold frozen packs, I don't know. But lining this coffin with cold packs and then covering them with a blanket and so they're not visible, and replacing those cold packs every day or every few hours, so that the process of decay due to heat is slowed down. And in almost every case, except in the case of an old body that was already decaying before death, otherwise, 3 days is a fine time to keep the body on ice. And at the end of that time, we take the body to have a funeral service. I choose to have the service in the Christian community churches, in which a full Service is created to sacrificially, ritualistically dedicate the body to the earth by praying over it with sacred prayers, saying, this human biography has transformed matter, calcium, silica, has transformed matter into the stuff of a human body. This body has been formed in the image of a human being. And we have held it, we hold it in love. And now the person has completely left it, and we can let the body fall to the elements. During those 3 days, when the body is on dry ice, we have a practice of having people come and visit the body. And our Christian community priest has spoken really carefully to our community about that and said, for him, it's not accurate to say that we're doing that to talk to the one who has died. The one who has died is already going through so much, reviewing the events of their life. They're not really with us, but it's important that we hold space for them. But especially, to my surprise, he said, in those 3 days, as we sit there and think sacred thoughts and honor that person, we're also preventing the etheric body, the elemental beings who are hungry to rip it apart for to take it back to prevents them from doing that prematurely. It's kind of like a guardianship saying, this was a temple, and this temple must not be disturbed for 3 days. We hold that. In the best case, it will be ritually thanked. I know not everyone will make that decision, but I think it's very beautiful if it is done. And then it can be either laid in the ground, put into a green burial, or burned. And as I understand it, one way or another, the body is given back over to the earth. And it really, from the perspective of the body, it doesn't matter if it is burned, cremated, or if it is laid into the earth and buried and decays slowly. I think it's less ideal if it's put into a heavy metal casket. Then the decomposition is decaying but won't go back into the natural world. So that's a bit trickier. So let's move on. If you've got any questions, try to note them so we can get back to them afterwards. Yeah, and from this moment then, the soul will go on into the Kamaloka that we've talked about already. But now I'll turn back to the book with Iris Paxino, and talk about, her next chapter is about what happens if one is trapped between two worlds, she calls it, trapped in a space where they can't move beyond the state of the etheric body. Interesting proposition. And in that case, she says, that person might still live in the etheric body for quite a while there. It's kind of harmonized around them. So we'll begin by saying a person who is still in the etheric state, the etheric corpse, if you will, an unusual term, but the etheric corpse, even right now, the etheric body that you wear very closely resembles your physical body. And so if a person can't dissolve this etheric body because they're trapped, and we'll speak about what that means, because they're trapped, then they can go to different places, feeling as if and appearing as if they're still the ghostly counterpart of who they were. There are other kinds of ghostly appearances where a person is in their astral body and they are more felt as a presence. But if one sees an apparition that actually looks like the person looked, then they are trapped in a sphere even closer to the earth. So Iris goes on to say, in ancient times, it was much easier to die. Before the beginning of the consciousness soul age, those of you who have studied anthroposophy, as we've worked on sometimes, anthroposophy tells us that the current task of the human being is to develop the consciousness soul, the spiritual soul. This is the contemporary task of humanity in the current 2000 years that we're living in, individuating this I am, this sense of self, separating from group consciousness, separating from tribal consciousness, going into the self-aware I am, which knows itself to be connected to all of humanity, but out of its own awakened intuition or experience, and not just by dissolving into group mores and group longings and desires and so on, half consciousness. So our age, the consciousness soul, began in the 15th century, will continue for the whole thing is 2100 years, so for another 1500 years. And she says, before this age began, death was much easier. Most souls had a similar journey after death. So that was you and me in another lifetime, we would meet our angel directly after death. And with the angel would be those who loved us. And with that guidance, we could pass through the realms of the spheres. At that time, the spirit of Ahriman, who is the spirit of materialism, had little influence over us. In our time, the situation is much more chaotic. And Iris says, it's actually alarming, not to be fear-mongering, but it's striking to see how chaotic the ether sphere around our Earth is. So not only do we have what's happening with the World Wide Web and the materialization and the predominance of mechanistic consciousness, but also souls are getting trapped in that mindset and almost woven into these webs. And to get back to the spiritual world, each person has to really want it. They have to want to find their way, to push their way through their darkness. And the angels are always ready to step in and to take them, but the person has to make the requisite inner effort to do it. We have to learn to perceive these beings, and this world is in chaos without us, without people doing that. These beings can be helped, must be helped, and there are people dead and people alive. So Iris Paxino was one of them, but also people who have died who are trying to help those people. But as I've said from the very first week, if a person doesn't know that they're dead, if they didn't believe in life after death, if they're expecting nothing, then they don't have any spiritual organs of perception to see what's happening around them when they die. They don't have eyes, ears, and they can sense that they're not in harmony with their surroundings, but it's a feeling this coldness, confusion, lack of light. And we can help them with our prayers and so on. They must be helped to recognize their situation and move on. And when Iris Paxino describes her many examples of these meetings, she said it's essential to help these people when she can get them to the point where they perceive their own angel. Then they can acknowledge what happened, that they're in another zone, and move on. So she tells stories. For instance, she was in a vacation house that was in Norway, and there was a man who was very angry that this house was visited by vacationers, kind of run like an Airbnb, and he had built the house and family didn't take care of it. Family wasn't even part of the house anymore. And all these strangers kept coming and the house was falling apart. And he was really unhappy about it. She wasn't aware of this in advance. He came then the first night they were there upstairs in the second floor, the story, and he appeared at the window and was gesturing, and she woke up and was afraid, gathered her forces. She said whenever she has a fearful situation, this was a fear-inducing situation because he was a very angry man. She said always and in every case, the Lord's Prayer helps. So you might notice that. And when she felt resolved, she went to the window and spoke with him. Found out in the psychic communication, it was because of his unhappiness with the house. But she had to explain to him, you have died, you're not here anymore. He couldn't believe it. Said, no, I'm not. Yes, you're not here. Look, how are you looking in the second story window? You don't even have a ladder underneath you. She said, I would like you to come on inside. And he moved closer to her and she said, look, you just walked through the window. You couldn't do that if you were in your body. Still argued. She had him walk through the walls. He hadn't even noticed. But finally, after conversation and counseling, she got him to the point where she could say, look, do you see this being who's next to you? This is your guide, your angel. And when he could see that angel, he went through the necessary inner shift. And then he could give himself over to the guidance of the angel and move on, and was no longer there, tormented by mysteries of the house. So I'm going to bring some more examples of what can happen, what can make problems. One level of problems, as I mentioned already, can be traumatizing death experiences like accidents, violence, or natural catastrophes. And sometimes in the case of an accident, if it's not a blessed accident, so some accidents will be things, a meeting with destiny that was already anticipated before birth. But some of them can be new karma that will then have to be balanced out in a next lifetime. But a person who, if this accident was really out of the blue, she tells that people can be stuck for some intermediate length of time at the intersection, for instance, where the accident happened. And she tells of more than one experience where she would drive down the road and she could feel this place has had an accident and there are still beings around that. She tells in this situation, she said, it's quite understandable that sometimes people put up crosses at the place where there's been an accident and kind of try to memorialize that spot. But she said, even though it's understandable, that's not helpful for the person because it becomes, she says, a kind of mausoleum for them. They're kind of stuck on that spot and they keep coming back to it, even though there's nothing there for them. And she does what she can to find that person and release them through her inner work. Violence can also cause that. And actually, she says, in those cases, there can be disparate parts of a person that engage with elemental beings in a space, because a person might not be in control of their own etheric body in that space. And that can cause the experience of poltergeists, for instance, knocking things off of shelves and so on. These are little abrupt disturbances in the energetic sphere of a room. We've probably all heard about them. They are not directly caused by the person, but by the person kind of violently disrupting the space that they're in when they're stuck between worlds. Of course, natural catastrophes, earthquakes, and so on can be a real shock for a person. They might get stuck. Rudolf Steiner did say when people die together in a natural catastrophe, interesting things happen. Those people will be connected far into the future. And in one place, he says people who die in an earthquake have the blessed situation that they will never again in any future life be a materialist. So it's a little bit encouraging, isn't it? Yeah. So she speaks also about mind-altering drugs, and what that can do is mind-altering medicines, as I mentioned before, that can keep a person from clearly seeing what they're going through. Also, drug addicts, of course. And she says if it's hard for them to release the addiction that's in their soul and their body. And until they can get free of that, they will continue to be drawn back to the place and the situation where they were able to satisfy their addictions. And she said it's often those street corners where they did their business, and often they will attach themselves, they'll glom onto, they'll kind of inhabit the drug dealers and other addicts. That means that addicts can very often be possessed, if you will, by drug addicts who have died. And she also makes a sideways glance at chemotherapy and says chemotherapy can be difficult because it can have the effect of really destroying much in the etheric body of a person, their life forces, and binding these forces that are killing the cancer cells, the excess life, that can make it difficult for a person to have a vibrant ether body. She said, by no means do I wish to imply in any way that a person shouldn't do chemotherapy if that's what they need to do in their lives. Not that, but survivors, it would be good if we recognize that that might be something that someone who's had chemotherapy might struggle with after they die. She speaks then also about some people who have died will be attached to a place and can't leave it. She speaks of how she was in a place in Germany, a kindergarten that seemed to have a really bad psychic energy. And she went to look at it, and as she moved her way around, first she researched the building, discovered it had been a place where Jewish people had been arrested and taken away by the Nazis and had died. And as she then started to feel out the space, she found that there was a woman who was still stuck there as an apparition because during the war years, her husband had got taken away from the transport. Not long afterwards, the Gestapo came to get her, and she hid in a closet. And she was already sick, but she hid. They found her. They took her, but she was in already such a state of grief and illness that her soul somehow, or a part of her, was still stuck in that closet. And even though she was immediately killed in the camps, something of her stayed in that closet and stayed for many, many years. And Iris said that she had the task of going in and talking to this lady and showing her that that situation was finished and she needed to find her angel and move on and also cease affecting the psychic space of that kindergarten. And after a while, it took some work, but after a while, that was successful. She speaks then also about the situation that it can be that someone who is left behind can't come to terms with the person's death, and they continue to drag them down. They continue to hold on to them, and they prevent the person from leaving. And that needs to be worked on both sides, including counseling for the survivor. But she said it's also possible that both the perhaps husband and wife, if we take a prototypical situation, both of them are so connected to each other that the one who has died and the one who still lives don't want to see the separation. So maybe for a few more years or decades, there's still a binding there. Not necessarily a good thing, but it's what it is. Then she speaks about the difficulties of someone who's a materialist, as I mentioned before. And a materialist says, or an atheist says, there's nothing after death. I'm not going to, there's nothing to see here. There's nothing here. And they live in a nihilistic situation, can't see, can't perceive. This is a tragedy. And it takes some work for people to come into, to awaken. And I can imagine this is also going to be an increasingly difficult situation for the more people get addicted to their computers, the more difficult it can be for them to free themselves into living thinking, to free themselves into a sense of reality beyond the machine. So we have to keep that in mind, let alone anyone who wants to do something transhumanistic and have themselves cloned to a machine. But I'm not ready to go down that rabbit hole with you right now. Another thing that can happen is a person who's afraid of dying. It might not be someone who's a materialist, but they're just too afraid to let themselves be dissolved and then reawakened after death so they can hold on in fear. Another situation, she says, is she calls it religious passivity. And that can be someone who, through their religion, was told, after I die, I will sleep, and I will sleep for 1,000 years or however long, and do nothing until the last trumpet sound and we are all awakened. And that person might, she calls it passivity. They just kind of die, and in a picturesque sense, they just lay down and say, hey, I'll just wait. There's nothing here. I'll wait till the last judgment. Then she goes on to throw in at the anthroposophists. She says, people who have dogmatic or intellectualized spiritual worldviews will have a hard time moving on. And so someone who has met anthroposophy, for instance, she also mentions theosophy and says it can be other ways, but specifically points at anthroposophists also and says, even if a person has studied spirituality, if they've studied it in such a way that they just have an abstract diagrammatic thought form and they haven't learned living thinking, they'll have a crystallized view of what happens after death, and that will imprison them to what they're actually going through. They'll live in fixed thought forms, and that can be a real difficulty. Then she turns to the act of suicide. And there she says, there are about 1 million suicides per year in the world. Tragic. Of those, 50% are depressions. 40% are caused by psychosis or addictions. And perhaps 10% are caused because of traumas or life crises. And that could also be, Lou Gehrig's disease or some kinds of situations where one is in an illness that there's no way out of. And people who have committed suicides will initially be shocked that they haven't been released from consciousness. They will face fear and confusion because, among other things, they discover they will see the unfolding of the future that they won't have. And in so many cases, that can be a future where they might have had another spouse. They might have had another chance to evolve, another learning, so many other things that could have happened that could have been blessings, and they threw it all away. And Rudolf Steiner says, in many cases, someone who commits suicide, they had actually the wrong and a kind of distorted, excessive attachment to their bodies and to life. And they were perfectionists. They said, this one's not good enough for me. If we can imagine how a depressed person would feel this. This isn't, this is a disconnect. I don't like it. I want out. Let me just end it all. And instead of cultivating gratitude for what is, they judge it all as negative. Of course, every one of us can imagine the pain that would lead a person to that. But the situation that they have placed themselves in is dire and painful and dark. And nothing will help them like the loving prayers of those who are left behind. So just a couple more before, and we're going to have to close already, so we'll take more next week. She mentions, to my surprise, curses. Like, I curse you, I wish you for 1,000 deaths. A curse that someone can throw at another. And of course, we don't think about that too much in our lives, but voodoo goes in that direction. And someone who is really accomplished at a curse could throw a spear of destiny that wounds another person. But if a curse is thrown to a person who is strong enough in their spiritual armor, a curse doesn't have to hurt someone. It can just bounce off. She speaks even in a more desperate way about black magic, in which there is deliberate manipulation of a person. And that can also be a distortion after death. Once again, the angelic beings of light are always there for deeds of redemption. And that will always work, but there can be some real difficult things at that time. So I'll just bring this picture once again, how she says the entire ether aura of the earth after humanity is at present in a great chaos. And of course, some people are able to enter the light directly after death in every case, but there's a great need for us to learn how to still feel connected to them, because really, whether we're dead or alive, we are one being with all human beings. And we need to know that all these other humans are with us. And if our brother and sisters are in need, we need to clean that and strengthen the earth. We're responsible. And I will bring one more picture where Rudolf Steiner said, people who cannot leave the earth because of their mindset after death, too materialistic, they can't get away from the earth. At some point, they will be driven right back into a premature reincarnation. And they will not bring life with them. They will bring death-bringing forces. And Rudolf Steiner said that these people will cause epidemics in the future. Just throw that one out there, because certainly we have a lot of people who have not been able to leave. It's not that they're personally in any way manipulating an epidemic, but the materialism is causing great chaos in the etheric world. And that's going to have a real impact on our natural, the kingdoms of nature and on the kingdoms of human beings. So, yeah, this is serious work. So what I didn't get to yet is talking about children dying, talking about abortions, and then walking through the next step when we go through the soul spheres and about the kinds of being stuck that can happen on that level if a person hasn't dealt with the unresolved parts of their personality. Those things that we don't honestly acknowledge after death become our karmic burdens in the next life. So next week, we'll deal with that. Also, how to hold space for those who have died, how to read to them. And all of this then in preparation for the next webinar series, which is going to begin on May 3rd. So at next week is the last one of this series. And then from there, we'll have a 2-week break. And then we start all over again with new registration, new signups, new reading suggestions, and a whole study of what it means to go to the end of the universe and then create a body that serves our karma. And there will be both eurythmy and lecture for that. So maybe before I open up for questions, even as we push these last minutes, let's take a moment to stretch. And then, as we've done before, do our movements of contraction and expansion. We're born out of the stars. And from the stars, we have clothed ourselves in spirit, we have clothed ourselves in matter, and we've come to birth. Inside your heart is that spirit that you were born out of. And after death, the spirit frees itself back to the stars. Notice what living etheric movement, eurythmy movement feels like. It's continuity of consciousness as you experience folding yourself into a body, unfolding into spirit. And just remember, you can do this every day. I hope you do. Eurythmy is one of the great preparations for life after death. Within my heart shines the light of the sun. Within my soul weaves the warmth of the world. I will breathe the light of the sun. I will feel the warmth of the world. Light of the sun pour in to me. Warmth of the world. And now drop your arms in our last movement. Warmth of the world. Flow through me. Just feel yourself present here in time and space, embodied harmoniously for the decades of your life. All right, let's take time for a few questions, and then I'll read the verse and we'll blow out the candle. Let's just take, we'll, we'll close within 10 minutes, but let me ask, Michelle, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do.
And I hear you.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yes.
Okay, going back to early in the class, or it just feels like early. Daryl asked, how do you know of these differing death scenarios? Has Rudolf Steiner written of these events?
Yes, but yes, he has. For instance, people who don't die, they have to come back really early, or how they're helped by others. He has written them, and because the narratives that I write, that I'm speaking of from Iris's book, correspond in just exquisite detail with what Rudolf Steiner said, I align myself with them. I feel that I have weighed them with the same earnestness that I weigh Rudolf Steiner's thoughts of anthroposophy. And believe me, I'm cautious about anything sensational. So no, this is not directly Rudolf Steiner's incident thoughts, but if you read the book, I think you'll go there too. I can relax into this book.
And just in case someone was not here with us when I put that into the chat, I just put it there again. Okay, let me go back to Patty and JC's question. There we go. Can you speak about someone who has died in their sleep and alone?
Yeah. For instance, our dear David Gershon died in his sleep and alone. It will be individual. And it depends, how blessed it might have been. But I think that can be a really wonderful way to go. It can be very, very blessed. For one thing, many of you might know that often people choose to die when they're alone, that they prefer not to have other people around. I know so many instances where the family has been around and go ahead, you can die. You can die now. You can die. It's okay. The person can't die until finally they're left alone. So dying alone can be okay. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
Judy offered some really interesting thoughts in the chat. And Judy, I'm wondering if you also want to add those to the conversation on the website. Yeah, that was fascinating. Okay, continuing on with the questions. Shashi said most people nowadays who have mental conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar are medicated with doses of medicine which create subtle and balancing altered states. How to perceive that?
Goshi, what a question, right? The healing that is done, the treatments that are done with the mindset that we can, with materialistic medicines, make changes in the astral body and ego of a person. So the whole mindset around that is very tricky. And in many cases, for instance, I know people who are depressed and they take these mood altering medicines and they feel that life becomes fuzzy for them, that they can't access authentic feelings. And in some cases that they might feel that that's a real blessing. They can be grateful for that. But they might also choose to get off of it. Or we think of the childhood medicines like Ritalin. Children who have been put on those medicines have been, I've met many adults who took Ritalin and they're really disjointed as adults because they missed many points of incarnating in their body. So those medicines disturb a person's whole constitution in profound ways. However, I won't go so far as to completely condemn them in the case of someone who is so profoundly disturbed that they're having hallucinogenic voices that tell them to kill themselves. I think I might seriously ask myself if it's better to take those medicines. Or if a friend of mine had electroshock therapy when he was having those tragic situations. I would hate to go through that, but I won't judge it, but I would be very, very cautious about it, obviously.
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay, Mary said, Steiner speaks about our return over and over to our moment of death, even the place we died, and that we get great nourishment from our birth into the spiritual world, that it can be a very beautiful point of contact for us. Can you speak to that? It seems that this would reflect a transition well met.
I think so too. I haven't heard him say a person returns again and again to the place where they died. And I would imagine that that is in the case of a death well died, that that doesn't last for too long. Because a person shouldn't be connected to that place. But there's another stage when, and we have to deal with this in another lesson, hopefully we get to it next week, when from the spiritual world, spirits who have died really well and spirits who reach initiate knowledge actually sculpt down into the earth and change the weather and the climate and help flowers to grow and all of those things. So there's another story there. Maybe that's what they are drawn back to touching and blessing the place of their death. Perhaps. Mary, thank you for that.
Yes. I may need help with this one. Shashi said, is more and more people becoming materialistic and fear death? Does it affect the balance of the spiritual worlds in the process of evolution?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Even in my last example of people bringing unwell forces to the earth, I think in the most extreme sense, we can say there is a spiritual crisis that this gorgeous, divine, fabulous planet that we live on could become so Aramanized, that means so captured by materialism that it becomes almost impermeable to spirit. The counter picture is that it was exactly to prevent that, that Christ, the spirit of loving light, incarnated onto the earth. But we have this dynamic question: will human beings prefer this materialistic stage, or will we, out of free will, seek the deep healing of the earth through love and light? But the crisis is right here in our lifetimes. Absolutely, yes.
Yes. Okay. Judith asked, what is living thinking?
So we talked about that a couple weeks ago. You might remember living, so dead thinking is abstract, it's analytical, it is only looking for answers, chop, 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 chop. And living thinking follows a process of cognition with full awareness. And And if you remember when I first brought this up a couple weeks ago, I said, for instance, the dead, and this is also true for us, but the dead forget nouns right at the beginning of the time after death. They forget their nouns because the only thing that they can live in is process. So this process of how things come into being, how things exist, what they are in a condition of love and growth and change and death and rebirth and all of that. This is a process of verbing. So even if I say mountain, can I say mountain as if it's a verb? And see and cognize mountaining coming into being. If I am going to talk to someone who has died and I want to say mountain, I can't just say Mount Shasta. I have to see mountaining as for what it is in its living quality. So that's Judith. And hi, Judith. Remember you? Judith, that's only a part of the answer. We'll have to go further into it, but it means learning how to exist in the etheric and overcome the mechanization in body, soul, and spirit of the material chop, 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 chop digital world. How much I would like to go further. But it's really time to close for the evening.
Oh, yeah.
And,
Yes, yes.
I am going to read the verse that I read again in the consciousness of what we have gone through. And then we'll put out our candles. Faithfully, I will follow your soul through the gate of death into the light engendering time places. With love, I will ease spirit coldness for you. With knowing, I will untangle spirit light for you. With thinking, I will linger with you. Living thinking, presencing with those people, not just calling forth a memory, but a presencing with them. And with gratitude and greetings, thank you for sharing sacred space. Let's close the space.